Welcome to this week's episode of Buffy Boys with me, Joel, and you.
I'm Brian, and this week I started moisturising. Thanks for asking.
You can already hear your skin gleam?
Crackling.
Yeah,
it's crackling.
Moisturise me. Let's get that out of the way.
Moisturise. No, let's not. Because most people aren't awful Doctor Who nerds like you.
Well, that's their loss. So this week we are watching and talking about the episode Nightmares. Plural? Nightmares?
Yeah, plural.
Yeah, Nightmares, and this was written and directed by...
Okay, so it was written by Joss Whedon and David Greenwalt, and I think he directed he wrote another episode in the season. I can't remember which, and I didn't think it was that important. And it was directed by Bruce Seth Green. And it was aired originally on May the 12th, 1997.
Okay, cool. I'm not surprised this is a Joss Whedon written episode because it feels very thematic.
So, actually, no, okay. What I was going to say there was actually going to be about the next episode, because I did a bunch of research about both episodes this afternoon, because we're recording the next one tomorrow morning, because you're away last weekend.
And we're very diligent.
We are diligent, and I just did a bunch of research on both, and now it's all bled into each other for me, so I can't remember which one's which. Okay.
Well, what will help you refresh yourself about this episode is you want to give us a quick summary from your book of summaries on what happened in the episode Nightmares.
Book of Buffy summaries. Like Buffy summaries?
I see what you did. It was almost a thing. It was like half a thing.
It was nearly there.
0.75%.
I would give it a 60 probably. Okay. So my book of summaries says... Oh, fuck.
That's the first thing it says?
Pretty much. Everyone's nightmare starts to come true, including the death and vampirization of Buffy. She and others manage to find the source of this, a child beaten into a coma by his baseball coach, and wake the child up. So my brother Kieran, who has been listening to the podcast, which is really nice of him.
Shout out to Kieran.
Hey Kieran, get a haircut. But he said that I told him that I thought that the summaries I used to give were shit. And he was like, yeah, it's true, but it was useful because I don't watch the show, so it actually gave you a good idea of what happened in the episode. So Joel, do you want to tell us what happened in the episode, please?
This is a great example of how you the listener can actually influence literally what we do on the podcast.
You can write into us and tell Joel not to pronounce it influence.
Okay, so Brian, do you want to give us a detailed and chronologically accurate and detail accurate summary?
Please no.
Okay, so this is the episode. This is ending up a bit like Friends, because with Buffy you have to be like, oh, the one with the whatever. This is the one where they all live out their nightmares, and where there's the big spooky guy who is basically a baseball coach who beat up a kid, and it's quite dark. But in terms of the chronology of the episode, the spoilers, what it ends up being is that the kid who was beaten up by his coach for failing at his little league baseball game, essentially, traps everyone in a nightmare realm where they live out their nightmares.
Or no, he doesn't. He brings the nightmare realm to them.
He does, yeah, and that's the technicalities, but essentially all bleeds together, much like your recollection of these two episodes.
True.
But in chronologically speaking, we start off with Buffy having a nightmare about getting killed by the Master, then she has to go to school, then a friend that they introduced called Wendell has a nightmare about spiders, and then we just see a lot of people's different nightmares. We see, Giles failing to be able to read anymore. We see Xander being chased by a clown from a nightmare bad birthday party he had when he was 6. We see Willow not being able to, or being pushed out on stage to do Madam Butterfly and not being able to sing, and a really soul-crushing scene where Buffy's father rejects her, which we'll get into in more detail. And throughout this, eventually they have their light bulb moment where they realise it's the kid, and they go into bring him through the nightmare scape and have him confront the coach and kind of release them all. And that's it really. It's really an examination of like some dark and some funny nightmares and what they say about the characters.
Agreed.
Okay.
Well done.
So before we get into all that in-depth trauma-related analysis, this is the casual banter portion of the episode. So how are you, Brian? How's your week been?
It was okay.
You do anything interesting?
Did I do anything interesting? No. I think... What happened this week? I can't remember.
You know what I did want to ask you, because it's a very topical meme at the moment, which means it'll be like 3 weeks out of date by the time people listen to this.
Okay.
But that thing at the moment where what's a really on-brand story about you from when you were a kid? What's a typical, like the most typical Brian thing you did when you were a kid?
Fuck, I wish you'd asked me to prepare this in advance. I have no idea.
Keep you on the spot.
Oh my god.
Or tell you mine while you're thinking of yours.
Yeah, please.
So I tweeted about this, so I do have this prepared. But the most on-brand story about young Joel was in 2001 when the last episode of Star Trek Voyager, Endgame, aired. It was a very big moment for me. I was very excited. So I attended the screening of this episode in a full Starfleet uniform, including a tricorder and phaser and various other Starfleet accessories. And this screening was in my living room, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I do still have this child's, medium-sized command uniform, obviously, which looking back now I regret because it wasn't even accurate to the show, so there was a discontinuity there. But
disgusting.
I was only 10.
That's fair enough. I can't think of anything particularly, cute and funny about like stories about myself, but like I literally did bring home dogs and asked my parents often could we keep them, basically.
You still do that?
Yeah. So if I went around the block for a walk, I'd find a dog. The dog would follow me. We would be best friends by the time we got back to my house. And I'd be like, "Can we keep them, please?" Mm-hmm. My parents always said no.
This isn't from when you were a kid, but I can think of a very on-brand thing you've done.
What?
The thing about the bit of ceramic.
Oh Jesus! We can't say that in the podcast. No.
Tell them.
So one time I stood on a bit, like I smashed a cup from the kitchen, and I accidentally stepped on a bit of it. It's only a tiny shard of ceramics, and Joel was like, "Okay, we have to do something about that." And you called one of our friends who's a doctor and asked for advice, and the doctor said, "Yeah, definitely go to a doctor's about that. It could be quite bad." So when Joel came back into the room after having done that, he found me with a knife and a tweezers, digging around my heel to try to find the ceramics to pull it out. Mm-hmm. And the reason I could find it was that I could feel the metal scraping up against the ceramics, and that's what I can tell. I was up against it, and I pulled it out, and I was like, yes, there we go. Yeah.
So basically, my nightmare is you.
Yeah, pretty much.
So now that no one's listening to this episode anymore after that horrific mental image, would you want to talk about what we thought was interesting or what you kind of picked out of this episode?
Okay. So come here. That first dream that Buffy has, where she's confronted with the master, a couple of interesting things there. One is that Buffy is so clearly powerless in the whole dream, which is so interesting. She's so clearly floating, doesn't know how she's found herself there, which I felt very dreamlike actively. But it was interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that she's wearing pigtails, so very specific representation of innocence.
Yeah, definitely.
And secondly, the master does actively strangle her, which is an unusual one for Buffy. Strangulation is a subversion of the classic neck biting. Obviously, it's very related, but it's a more aggressive act because it's not a sustenance act. If you see in a couple episodes,
it's more violent.
It's more violent. It's less temptation. It's more like I want to kill you rather than I need to survive. So that's quite interesting. Yeah, so I found that specifically sexual. It's also interesting because
you found that specifically sexual?
Yeah, the choking.
Okay.
Yeah, that kind of domineering, kind of like I hate using the phrase, but slightly rapey tone to the way the master approaches her. Definitely.
I don't think it's inaccurate at all to say that there's like an assault and a violation of intimacy to the whole thing. Yeah, and just totally appropriate. Yeah, and just the fact that she's like portrayed so innocently in that episode, in that scene, I thought that very heavily reflected what I saw as a specific theme in this episode, which was child abuse. I thought there was some implication that there's some childhood sexual abuse being done to the kid. Obviously, there's a very specific physical abuse, but yeah. And then the other thing to note about that dream is that it's a prophetic dream, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Which are noteworthy. And I think that because she comes under his thrall. Yes, so that's actually something I wanted to mention that does tie into what you were saying. This is a very specific example of the master using what in vampire mythology would be called mesmer, or putting people under their thrall, which is something you associate with more classical, romantic with a capital Dracula. M, capital M, Jesus, capital or, Dracula, exactly, that kind of thing, where you're powerless to resist their entrancing. And it's not something that really happens in Buffy, because most vampires in Buffy are animals, and that's kind of how they're portrayed. So yeah, I do think that it's prophetic. It ties into a lack of control, a casting of her as, okay, well, she's meant to be this powerful warrior, but she's a girl and he's a grown man, and there's a bit of she needs to erode that power dynamic a little bit to be effective. But I think you're 100% right. It is her nightmare there is what can a 16-year-old girl, no matter how powerful, do against a grown man? That's kind of what she's trying to write against.
Totally agree. Yeah. And it's just like, it is, I think, a great expression of the ultimate fear that the vampire represents, which is both the fear of aging and, a lack thereof, and sexual aggression. I thought it was a really interesting scene. But and then Buffy wakes up and she's sleeping on a fucking doily.
Yeah, she does tend to sleep like in kind of bed dressing, and makes her look like she's taken to her bed as a Victorian woman who has come down with the consumption, or whose vapors aren't right. But yeah, no, it's interesting. Actually, notably, they don't really highlight it very much, but it's the first direct interaction that the Master and Buffy have is in this episode. They've always been talking about each other from other locations, and it's weirdly not like dramatic. In classic Buffy fashion, it's taken quite casually.
Yeah, no, it's so one of the things I read while reading around this episode was apparently Joss Whedon actively for this first season wanted to avoid a season where Buffy fights back against the Master in every episode. So that's why in the last episode it's actually when they meet for the first time in person, because this is obviously a dream, so you're not even sure if it's a reset for the Master as well as everyone else in town at the end of the episode. So you couldn't be sure if he remembers her. But specifically, he wanted to avoid having the Master occur too often in this season,
which is great because like some of the best villains in genre fiction, like a classic thing that happens to them is that they're diluted by overexposure, because if you can beat them too many times, they lose their potency. Obvious examples being the Borg from Star Trek, the Daleks from Doctor Who, subverted or avoided with things like Kilgrave in Jessica Jones, who remains a threat until he's not, essentially, so you do need to keep that threat there, and they do that absolutely with the Masters.
They really do, and when you get to the last episode in the season, he feels like a terrifying bastard. It's great. One of the very clear themes in this episode is definitely fatherhood. You mentioned this right before we started, but definitely one of the textual and subtextual themes is fatherhood. We can identify three very clear father figures: Hank, Summers, the Master, and Giles.
Yes.
The scene after Buffy's had her dream, they're in school, she's talking to Willow, and she has a really heartbreaking little conversation with her where she says that her father's coming over and she's worried that she's the reason that her parents divorced. Yeah. Which I found really sad.
And she very much takes it on herself and says, look, I was a handful, I caused all this trouble. What I found a little strange is, for the sake of the episode, they had to portray it as the first time that she's told Willow about her family situation to a certain degree. But yeah, like for a show that is... There's something very interesting to be said about a show that's so much about gender dynamics and female relations and all that, which, for better or worse, are often defined in situations that are traditionally patriarchal, and that you actually don't get all that much mention of her father throughout the series. But where it does, like this episode, it's a specifically undermining situation, because I would note that in the two episodes that are most iconically that he's actually in, the other one being where I actually couldn't tell what season it is. Season 6, where Buffy has an episode where she thinks she's in a mental asylum and she's never been the Slayer, and he's present there. They're both situations where her literal reality is undermined and her sense of self is undermined, and he's present during it, Yeah. So yeah, her concerns about how she may have been the cause of her parents' marriage falling apart due to something that she can't avoid, which is being the Slayer, is one of her more humanizing is the wrong word, but like when I say and I don't want to say human as opposed to Slayer, but one of her more ordinary moments, her moments of normalcy.
With that, in terms of how father figures represent in this episode, it's quite integral to the theme of the episode. So the theme being kind of accepting what you can and can't control, what or accepting your own destiny, facing your fears, of it being a huge one. Which I'll note, apparently the only person who really faces his fears in this episode is fucking Xander. Oof. Anyway, but so Buffy's message to Billy is obviously you need to face your fears. You need to be the person who takes this onto themselves and to pull up the mask of the monster, which he does in the last scene. In the last scene within the nightmare. That's kind of
pre-Koga scene, essentially.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so obviously that like reflects as well Buffy's difficulty in taking on the mantle of the Slayer, because to do that she has to abandon a relationship with her father in her mind, and the tension between home life and this difficulty she's experiencing is pretty interesting. It's really cool.
Yeah, definitely. And I think she talks a lot and struggles a lot in these initial seasons with essentially having to give up her normal life to be the Slayer. And what this episode made me realize is the Totem, the most iconic thing about her normal life was her parents being together. There is this disconnect, this unavoidable association between when she became the Slayer and when her family fell apart, so that she kind of ties together. I will note as well that we've talked before about the ambiguous Charlie Brown-like nature of Xander and Willow's parents.
Yeah.
This episode does confirm that Willow has a father, because she does acknowledge that her parents often glare at each other.
Yeah, and bicker.
But I think, again, it was potentially the only even inference that she has a father in the entire show.
No. They referred to him in season 2 or 3, whatever, the Hansel and Gretel episode.
Like maybe like her mother is in that episode for certain,
yeah.
But the father is like quite an ambiguous figure, in my opinion.
Oh no, he definitely is. The other father figure, of course, being like a addendum father figure being the baseball coach. You know,
Yes.
this person who's supposed to take care of children and ends up like damaging them. Which is an important one.
Yes, 100%. So just for context, for people who haven't obviously seen the episode recently, it's that the coach who, you know, calls the main kid, who's the subject of the episode, Billy, calls him Lucky 19. But essentially when he doesn't catch the ball at the right time, you know, it's said that he kind of beaks him into a coma. And how this guy manifests in Billy's nightmares as this hulking figure with, which they never actually acknowledge this, but with what is essentially a baseball-like mutated arm that is unstoppable. And he calls him the Ugly Man. And it's this enhanced kind of like nightmarish figure, which reminded me of two things specifically. One, very much a Resident Evil villain.
Oh yeah.
So there's a real tradition in Resident Evil video games and subsequent derivative horror games of an unstoppable figure like this who just continually comes towards you. And maybe most recently you would see this in It Follows in the horror tradition to a certain degree. It's kind of gone out of fashion. Like horror has gone in a different direction, but this one unstoppable person. And what it also reminded me of is a comic book series which I'm reading at the moment, which Brian recommended, called Lock and Key,
which I haven't read, so I shouldn't have recommended.
Yeah, but it was very good. And basically, these kids, their father's murdered. They move back to his ancestral home as a house full of various keys that can like unlock your mind, and you can take things out of your brain or unlock doors to different places, etc. One of the things they have in that is when they pick memories literally out of people's heads, they don't look like the actual person, they look like how they remember them. So they can't figure out who the monster is because the kid saw the person in the dark and was scared of them, so it looks horrific, very similar to how this guy is in this episode. So it's all this thing about how memory is entirely fallible in terms of how you represent people.
That really reminds me of one of my favorite things about The Good Wife, which is one of my favorite shows. The Good Wife is incredible. So
this is a great story.
This is a great story, yeah. So The Good Wife, there's a great episode where, somewhat famously, the main character remembers herself in a flashback scene wearing a blue dress, and another character who she's sleeping with, he remembers her in a red dress. And Joel, when we were watching this, managed to come up with a theory which is completely accurate, and I tweeted about it, and I got 2 retweets about it, so it must have been really good.
Very popular.
Yeah, about how throughout the show, whenever the main character is feeling like a good wife, which sounds so silly, but basically a metaphor for being the good person, the morally upright citizen, the good mother and good partner, she's wearing blue. So a very regal and very
calming,
pure. Purity is always blue. It's the Virgin Mary, etc. And when she's feeling sexual, or when she's feeling like she's giving in to her own desires, she wears red. And that's actually consistent through the show. And when she's feeling ambiguous, this is the best part, she wears fucking purple. And this was a great thing to talk about, at the time it was great to talk about, because I remember that was a night and we were drinking, because we would be drinking. And I was saying to you, and Joel, what do red and blue make? And you're like, green? And that's how I found out that you don't understand any color theory.
Don't go away.
Yeah. Okay, here. So
just like adding on to that, just very quickly, is someone did say to me the other day, I make some remark like that, and they turned around completely unironically and said, "Oh, are you colorblind?"
Oh wow, yeah. Was that in my house?
It may have been in your house. Someone also said it to me in a different context as well. Fuck. So I present as a colorblind person through my inability to describe color.
Yeah, color or music.
Or music. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Giles has a very specific father figure like scene in this episode, which is where he mourns Buffy standing over her grave in the nightmare zone, and basically explains that this is his nightmare, that he has not had so many nightmares about Buffy dying, and how she was so talented and she was so gifted, and how he thought he could basically help her, but he's failed her and he should have trained more with her and stuff. And that's such a genuine fatherly moment. Where he wants to protect her. He doesn't want her out in the world alone. I thought it was great. It was real, it was resonant.
It was great, and what we noticed was this episode, for some reason, has a lot of connections and a lot of resonance with the musical episode of Buffy.
It does.
And he specifically has a song where he talks about not being able to protect her anymore and his fatherly relationship. Some other things we mentioned is that Willow has a line where she says, spiders, what do they need so many legs for anyway? Which is very similar to what Anya says about bunnies, what do they need such good eyesight for anyway? There is a reference where Giles says in this episode, it's not dreams, it's nightmares. If it was dreams, it would be the musical comedy version of this.
And of course, in that episode, in that same song about with the Anya line, is a line about we could be dreaming. Actually, this is Willow says this. We could be dreaming. We could be stuck in some kid's wacky Broadway nightmare.
That's exactly it.
Which is a direct reference to this, of course. But yeah.
And so it's weird resonance there. But what Giles says, and again, the lines and moments that elevate the show, and this is definitely going to be the quote that I use to promote this episode. When he is
okay. I thought we were democracy, but go on.
You never contribute that line.
I do. I put them in the notes
for the website post.
Oh, yeah. I haven't been on the website yet.
Yeah, there we go. It's a good website. Check it out. I'm quite happy with it.
www.gofuckyourself.com.
That actually redirects to our website. It doesn't. Don't go there. It's probably
www.penisland.com.
Pen Island. That's a throwback.
Yeah.
Don't look that up, Mom. Mom. Was I talking to your mom there?
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, let's circle back.
Yeah.
What Giles says in a fantastic delivery from Anthony Head is when he's talking about failing Buffy, he says, but you were so gifted and the evil was so great.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking. And
I was being really reaching, and I saw a connection between that and
The Gift.
Yes.
The Gift being the episode of season 5 where Buffy dies.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I can, that's the kind of wispy threads that as English graduates we can turn it into an essay. So absolutely.
Yeah, especially given that the next episode after that she punches her hand up through the soil again.
Yeah, so in this episode she's buried alive, and that's not only part of one of Buffy's nightmares, but Brian, you were saying about Sarah Michelle Gellar?
Yeah, so apparently this episode set when filming, Sarah Michelle Gellar is a little bit claustrophobic, and to be honest, in this shot, basically they had a cutaway side of a coffin and they could see into her. But they put her in a coffin and they dump a bunch of soil on her, which I'd imagine has to be reasonably has to trigger reasonably similar brain stuff as getting waterboarded.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But apparently she's reasonably claustrophobic and she had a panic attack during this, and Joss Whedon promised her she'd never have to do anything like that again.
So yeah, there's definitely resonance there with Buffy, resurrecting in season 6 in the grave and having to dig her way out. But the scene with Giles was particularly poignant from a positive father role model scene because of the nightmare scenario that Buffy has with her father, which had me in tears. It genuinely did. It was beautifully acted by Sarah Michelle Gellar. Her father did a good job of what he needed to do in that scene anyway, but it's not really him, or if it is, he doesn't remember it as part of the nightmare scenario. But he basically comes to pick her up, and long story short, takes her aside. It's like, oh yeah, no, everything's fine. Your mom is fine. I just kind of wanted to come and tell you that you're old enough now to realise whatever else we said, the reason we broke up was because of you. And why wouldn't we? Look at you. Who would want to spend any time with you? You were rude, you were sullen, and you didn't turn out to be as bright as we thought you would be. To be honest, I'm surprised I spent this much time with you so far. And she's not even angry. She's just sad, and it's the worst. It's absolutely awful. The worst.
One of the things I read about this episode was that apparently whenever Buffy's upset and then goes to fight, she usually does badly in the fight, which is understandable. For implication of a person. But apparently it's a consistent thing that happens in the show, where if Buffy's upset, she's going to do badly in the next fight, basically.
Yeah, because Buffy's, and I think this is consistent with most Slayers, their vulnerabilities are emotional, they're not physical.
Yeah.
Like any Slayer we've seen killed has always been distracted by something. Like there's I actually learned this Slayer's name recently, I've lost it again, but the Box Rebellion Slayer, the Chinese Slayer.
Oh, I wouldn't know, I'm sorry.
I looked it up because I was reading about the lineage of Slayers. I think it might be Jing Ro, and then obviously the Robin's mother in the 80s. They all get distracted by something family related or something personal, you know, and that's when they die. Yeah,
that's a good point. And of course that like ties into Buffy's whole thing about her strength as a Slayer being the opposite of every other Slayer, in that she has a community and she relies on them, which of course is a theme in this episode, which towards the end Buffy gives Billy the advice that, you know, you're only one member of a team, there's 8 other players on the field, so you can't be the one person who fails a team. Yeah, which is advice that Buffy should give herself. It's a consistent problem for her throughout the show, that she can't integrate the fact that she is part of the community, and that is her strength. Yeah, she finds it really difficult to engage with that.
That's definitely true. Although one thing she said in this episode, which I thought was very supportive of that, is when she first gets attacked by the ugly man, she says, he's too strong, we need to find my friends, they'll help. And that's just the thing that Buffy does that other people don't do in this scenario, you know?
Agreed.
And then when she does find them, and her nightmare is that she gets sired by the master, becomes a vampire, they don't try to stake her. Do you know what I mean? There's a moment of like, okay, well, obviously you're a vampire, but, you know, we're going to try and figure this out. And she actually, I think maybe there's something interesting in the fact that she retains her personality, even though presumably in her dream she wouldn't be ensouled. Yeah. So
it's obviously just like, it's just dream logic. It's not.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think the fact that they go forward together, and obviously she's able to then fight the ugly man, not only because of her personal revelation, but as we said, she has vampire and Slayer strength. And there's something to be said there about taking the beast, the amount that the Slayer needs to take the beast into themselves to combat the beast is kind of a recurring thing. Slayers aren't pure in any traditional sense of purity, but traditional senses of purity are what the show is writing against to a certain degree, yeah. Totally. And problematizing and all that.
And you know a little bit about that Slaypire concept, right?
Yeah, so just kind of talk about some of the weird Slayer stuff, Slayer mythology.
Please
stuff
do.
Here.
I'll leave.
Thank you. So this is the only example we have in the televised series of a Slayer who becomes a vampire, or what the expanded Buffy canon has called, unsurprisingly, a Slaypire.
I think a Vamplayer would be better.
Vamplayer. Well, no, because that's actually like specifically already a thing.
Fangbanger, like.
No, Jesus.
That's a thing from True Blood.
It is, that's true. No, so Slaypires, this is the only example, this is the only time Sarah Michelle Gellar is ever in vamp makeup in the show. But in the expanded continuity, after the end of the finale, thousands of people worldwide become Slayers, and 1,500 of them come together in a Slayer organization that basically fights evil across the world, etc. It's a comic book scenario. But they do examine often what happens if Slayers get turned, and one Slayer who gets turned, it becomes a primary antagonist. There's also a flashback to a Slayer who did get turned a few hundred years ago, who was stricken from the records. So there's kind of more of an examination of this. There's also a thing, and this is just to show you how book wild the comic book series is, after they destroy the Siege of Wonder and all the magic goes in the world, people still get turned into vampires, but they don't have any demon in them anymore, so they're just zombie vampires or zompires as a whole thing. But something we talked about in the last episode, I think, but was about who came immediately before Buffy. Mm-hmm. And why isn't this something we talk about more? It seems like the thing you would touch on. So I looked it up. There's very little on it. It's a Slayer called India Cohen,
who apparently isn't as pretty as Buffy.
Yes, so the master says you're not as pretty as the last one. Now, it's ambiguous whether he means the last one I met or the last Slayer, but India is represented in a couple of expanding universe novels that she was an American on a Japanese naval base. Her father was a soldier.
That's so cool.
And she basically traveled around Japan fighting vampires with her watcher, who was in love with her. It was like a younger watcher, and there was like a weird kind of like Romeo and Juliet kind of situation there about the forbidden love and all that kind of stuff. And she eventually sacrifices herself to save her family. Which is kind of an interesting counterpoint to like Buffy then immediately being called after that, you know?
Yeah, of course.
So completely non-canon as much as anything is canon Buffy universe, but kind of an interesting addition, I think.
No, I totally agree. How quickly did you think that something awful was going to happen to Wendell after he got a name and they started interacting with him?
Yeah, so like Wendell, it was this like weird ponytail character they introduced, pretending that they've always been friends. Oh, Wendell.
Old Wendell.
Wendell with the spikers.
Love him.
Wendell, whose favourite spikers died when his brothers didn't take care of them when he was sent away to wilderness camp, which is not a thing, America.
It for sure fucking is. Isn't that the camp in The Parent Trap?
I've never seen The Parent Trap.
I've watched it with you.
I've never remembered seeing The Parent Trap.
Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah, I'm aware that Lindsay Lohan is in it.
It's amazing.
And wasn't there something where either you or me didn't realise she didn't have a twin?
I didn't realize when I watched it when I was like 7 or 8, but I do know that now.
So wilderness camp, I just can't understand. It sounds like where extremists would be trained in America.
Survivalists.
That's where I'm looking for. Yeah.
No, I agree. The story that he tells about his spiders getting dehydrated and drying out and dying because his brother leaves a lamp on, and that he has nightmares afterwards. I was like, that's a reasonably good piece of writing.
Yeah, it's not bad.
I was impressed. I liked it.
It's like when we were discussing this episode, I said where the last episode was the Goosebumps episode, this is the Twilight Zone episode. Because Twilight Zone carries those 1 or 2 lines that kind of stick with you. Where it's like, that's creeped me out. Yeah, and this is very much like that.
And it's topical because the first trailer for Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone TV show was released yesterday.
Yeah, and Jordan Peele is?
Jordan Peele directed Just Get Out, and he's also a comedy actor. So
yeah, so very exciting. And he's also directing Us, which is coming out soon, which looks horrific, and we're very excited for it.
Yeah, we're gonna have a new podcast about Twilight Zones, and it's going to be called Twilight Twinks.
I knew you were going to say that. I could feel it coming. Like I could feel the ringing in my bad knee. It was awful.
Well, we're twinks, so
so some other stuff I'm going to mention, unless you have something specific you want to just go on to.
No. I think we're skipping all over the place, and I love it.
Yeah, it's great. It's
structure,
dynamic. This is the word that's really popular in work at the moment. We're disrupting things. This is disruption.
Just imagine all those like 50-year-old women being like, let's disrupt things, Barbara.
Yeah, I love how in 2019 I can be disrupting things, and that's innovative, as opposed to like a few years ago where it'd just be like, I'm unprepared. But let's go ahead. Just taking through a couple of things I thought was interesting. The Master kind of paraphrases H.P. Lovecraft at the start of the episode when he's instructing the Anointed One, where he says fear is the most powerful force in the world.
Okay.
And H.P. Lovecraft says something to the effect of that the oldest emotion and oldest power in the human world is fear, and the oldest fear is the fear of the unknown.
Sure.
I just think that's something interesting to...
I wouldn't personally see that as a reference there or even a nod. I think they're related. But
yeah, no, I just think they're thematically similar rather than references. But
for sure.
I went, oh, interesting. And he talks a little bit about pain, how pain is controllable. And he burns himself on the cross to indicate this.
I have a question for you about that, but go on.
I have a question, which may be your question. But he meditates or discusses the fact that he has a mortal fear of the cross, which he doesn't understand, but he does have it. Why are vampires in Buffy afraid of Christian imagery?
Yeah. Okay. So it is an odd one. I don't think you would include that. If I was writing this show, I wouldn't say, oh, the cross is just 2 pieces of wood. Why am I so damaged by this? Because it actually is a problem historically, in the sense that my question is, vampires existed well before Jesus.
Yes.
Vampires wandered the world before humans, in fact. Right?
Oh, are you talking about in canon or
canon? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I mean, at some point were they fine with crosses? Then Jesus came along and he was so pure and good that the image of him throughout the world damaged vampires.
Yeah, it doesn't really carry with how the show portrays these things.
No, and that's fine. I mean, like, I'm grand with the cross imagery, and it means that you get to bring in lots of Christian imagery and Jesus stuff into the show, and that's great. Love it. But I don't think you get the characters to inspect, like, why am I afraid of this? Because that really just means that we're gonna look at that and we're gonna say, why are you afraid of that? That makes no sense.
An potentially interesting point on that is one of the better sci-fi novels that maybe you've never read. One has never read, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson.
Sure, which is the basis for the movie with Will Smith, right?
Well, like, yeah, but like the same way that like iRobot is the basis for iRobot. Like,
it's another Will Smith movie. Nice.
Yeah, I know, but like they're not like super, like, if you've seen the film, you don't necessarily know the book.
Yeah, sure.
But
your copy of that book was so... Oh, sorry. No, Kieran actually had a copy of that book, and it was really lovely. It had like curved edges.
That's not my copy, you know.
It was so nice. Anyway, go on, please.
So it's cool. So it's basically set in a post-apocalyptic vampire scenario, but it examines that vampires actually did happen and why did they happen, and it was basically a bacterial thing. But they examine this concept of the Christian imagery, and the conclusion they come to is that it's a purely psychological thing, that the vampires, which are basically infected humans, have a psychological reaction to it, and that it doesn't work on Jewish vampires, but the Torah does, and so on and so forth. So that's the only elegant way I've ever found that someone's kind of sidestepped that problem. It's like, oh yeah, people do react to it because people react to it, but not because it has any actual value.
That's interesting. So you think that the Chinese slayers are having no luck with the crosses?
I would say that if I was writing for Buffy and I wanted to shore this up, I would say that a Christian person made this true, as in like cast a spell or make it so vampires would react to this, and that was a decision an actual person made rather than something on high. That would be my feeling about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have a couple of interesting little bits for you. So one of them is that the aria that's being sung from Madame Butterfly when Willow comes on stage. I read this a couple of different places because I thought it was a bit too much to be accurate. Mm-hmm. But apparently the one of the lines that the guy is singing to her is, "Child from whose eyes the witchery is shining."
But she's a witch, Brian.
She becomes a witch, Joel.
Foreshadowing.
Yep. So there we go. She's a lesbian from day one, confirmed.
A witchy lesbian.
Yep. Another couple of bits. So when the Master puts Buffy into the grave, mm-hmm. the quote he uses, or the thing he says is, "A dream is a wish your heart makes," which is from Cinderella.
Bizarre.
Yeah.
Utterly bizarre.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually the second instance of the Master doing a reasonably recent reference. So the first one is in episode 1 or it might be episode 5 where he says, "Here endeth the lesson," mm-hmm. which I think we said at the time when we were recording that episode that it was a 50s preacher reference or something like that. But anyway, it indicates that he's somewhat aware of pop culture. And this one specifically paints him as part of the youth culture by accessing a pop culture reference and using it in a fight. It's very, very Slayer slangy versus where he usually speaks is very very old world.
Yeah, well, like he needs to be a threat, like fundamentally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's one of the best things about Buffy is that the enemies always exist in a very nebulous space of having some of the traits and some of the perspectives of our heroes.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's great. So one of my big things for this episode, was I have read a good bit about trauma theory as a literary theory, specifically Kathy Carruth, who we were out for a drink with our friend the other day, last week, and he said that he actually knew Kathy Carruth when he studied in Yale, which is so nice.
Shout out to Jake.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So I was just like chatting about Kathy Carruth, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I know Kathy." And I was like,
"Good old Kathy."
Of course you do. Good old Kathy.
Shaggy Kathy.
Yeah. So trauma theory it's a very heavily Freudian theory, which is that essentially once a traumatic event occurs, that from that wound, the voice of your trauma echoes on a consistent basis. So I have a couple of quotes here that I took down while we were reading the episode or watching the episode, the other one. So it's repetitive reenactments of people who have experienced painful events is kind of like what's happening generally. And so Kathy Carruth's theory is generally, it has a lot to do with German poetry and stuff, so I don't know any of that shit. But it's the moving and sorrowful voice that cries out, a voice that is paradoxically released through the wound. In this episode, that can be applied to this episode really, really nicely. Because, first of all, very importantly, in Buffy episodes, you always want to be looking at what they're being taught in the classroom.
Yes.
So in the next episode, we're going to talk about the Merchant of Venice because they're learning Merchant of Venice in the classroom and it's all about revenge. So it's great. In this episode, they're being told about active listening as a psychological mode, which is interesting because what she says there is that the fundamental need is to be heard. So in a person's life, when they're experiencing trauma, what they most need is to be heard and engaged with and to be able to reconcile that with their experiences, the trauma or the pain they experience. So in this episode, the voice like crying out from the wound is both the nightmare existing within all of Sunnydale and reflecting the trauma and psyche of this kid. And also then there's the active verbal echo of Lucky 19 that occurs through the episode, which is interesting because it's both this is why I thought it was a sexual abuse situation, is that's a term of affection. Yeah, you can almost hear it being like muttered in a kind of dirty or
some tousled hair kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly, and tousled hair and that kind of image that's supposed to be very innocent but ends up not being. The fact that he had such an affectionate name for him, and that is the source of the trauma, that basically it's a trigger that like. But let's say if this kid was saying, terrified by the fact that he was, if the monster, the ugly man kept repeating the phrase, you should have done better, you'd be like, yeah, okay, that's fine, that kid was beat up because he wasn't doing good enough. But the tension there is that this kid has experienced affection from this man, the baseball coach, and has been betrayed by him and attacked by him on the basis of his failure. So that repetition of Lucky 19 was very, very, for me, much a cry from the wound of this like paradoxical and tension-laden term of affection from the thing that's just beat you up and put you in coma.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a term that's been completely soaked with emotional accelerant, and yeah.
And one of the trauma theory things is that trauma creates fractured narratives, so that repetitive voice stands to break a narrative on a consistent basis and to interject. And that was my theory as to why this episode felt so fucking fractured.
Okay,
because it's so lacking in structure.
So it was a conscious expression, structural expression.
Oh
of
yeah,
trauma theory. Yeah.
Joss Whedon actually went forward in time, read this book by Kathy Carruth, and wrote an episode about it.
He astrally projected forward in time.
Asteroidally projected, actually.
So this is our first example of the episode of astral projection, or as Buffy puts it, Billy's asteroid body, which I laughed at heartily.
Yeah, it was great. Loved it.
Yeah, no, but I think like if there's a theme or a theory that underpins Buffy in many ways, it's definitely trauma, because most genre fiction doesn't really examine the real world trauma of what these things would imply, and it returns and recurs in Buffy extensively.
Totally agree.
Okay, so a couple of small passing Buffy bits I just want to mention about this episode. Fashion is terrible, once more.
Yep.
There is Xander is wearing a 3 sizes too large shirt that is patterned like a load of postcards.
My notes, I have it down that he's wearing something that looks like he mashed up all the Sistine Chapel paintings onto his shirt. Yeah,
he just kind of rogue. Remember when Marge like applies makeup to her face using a shotgun?
Oh yeah.
It was like that, except with a pattern on her shirt. But he also had pattering trousers on underneath it, and a heavy black t-shirt as well. It just was not good. And generally, whenever you saw any of the kids, they looked like they were auditioning for Cats. There was like a lot of like big theatrical outfits on. There was, in terms of not bag fashion, but which I will mention, Giles' nice little petite neck scarves make a reappearance. He always wears it to the hospital specifically. He visits wearing that scarf.
Yeah, it's his Paisley scarves.
And Buffy had a nice baby blue leather jacket again, which was quite fashionable. And she was sucking on her lollipop again, which is something that we've mentioned before.
Very, very Britney.
Very Britney. Yeah, very, very, very topical in that regard. Possibly some of the best fashion moments in the episode was from our one and only Cordelia Chase.
The next episode is a big Cordelia episode. Yeah. I'm very excited.
Cordelia had, other than providing this comic relief, Cordelia had no acknowledged involvement in the episode. They didn't speak to her, but the joke was Jaws kind of like dramatically almost like pulling off his glasses, like, oh my god, everyone's worst nightmares will be coming through. It could be a hellscape. And then it cooks to Cordelia with big frizzy hair being like, I was just at the salon, I can't comb it, the comb breaking, and then some nerds with pocket protectors dragging her off and her screaming, I'm not even in the chess club, there's some mistake here. And she's dressed exactly like that episode of Sabrina the Teenage Witch where Libby becomes uncool.
Yeah.
And she says, hey, function over fashion, guys. I remember that line. It's seared into my brain. Yeah. But she wears like a big kind of like Puritan dress, high, socks. It's
great.
It's every 90s girl's nightmare of how to dress, apparently, which rudely is almost exactly how Willow dresses in the first couple of episodes.
Yeah,
it's a very specific reference.
She does actually talk to Buffy a little bit in this episode when she tells her that she has to go to the history test, which is a very stressful moment.
She does. But that was Buffy's first nightmare, as being in this history test. I don't know if Cordelia was actually there, or she is. Practically.
I think so, she is.
I feel like Buffy's nightmare might be that Cordelia is really competent and is like, what, the test? The test is no problem. Why can't you get it right, dummy?
Yeah.
She was definitely part of that nightmare scenario. I don't know if that test actually happened. Do you know what I mean?
I think that so from my perspective, the whole episode is about reality bending and reality maneuvering. So I think that the stuff happens around the people. I think that these things are happening. That's why you can see other people's dreams, even though you're not part of them anymore.
No, I agree. Anyway. I think they're definitely happening. I just feel that she might have been under the same spell that Hank was under.
Yeah, no, for sure. She's being influenced by the nightmare. No doubt.
Yeah, which I think something else I want to mention is something this episode papers over, and it happens in genre TV shows a lot. Billy is one of the most powerful creatures in the Buffy universe.
Yes,
like
he releases the Master, which is a very difficult thing to do by all accounts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's happening in Supernatural, where like an angel and a demon have a kid, and that kid is the Antichrist, etc. And they just leave that in one episode and move on. But anywhere, if you look to any comic, your Franklin Richards, your David from Legion, any anyone who has that level of reality bending power is unstoppable, and they just kind of like move on from it quite quickly.
That's not fair. X-Men never move on from it. They actively look at that. Omega level mutants and mutants being overpowered and insane reality bending beings is actually a consistent like theme of looking at in X-Men.
Oh no, I agree with you 100% about X-Men, which is why I'm saying if you don't have that space to do it, don't do it in this one episode and then let go.
Would have to agree. Especially when you're going to hand wave the implications as being, we're on the Hellmouth, anything can happen.
Yeah, and just in terms of some of the other reality bending effects, I don't know if it was just that, you know, Billy not really understanding these things, but some of the background characters were drawn with quite broad strokes. Like there was these like tough school bullies who were like, oh, I'm going to beat him up down by the water reservoir in my, you know, fireworks. But they were dressed like the bullies from Back to the Future too. Like they big square sunglasses, and then his mom comes around the corner and like embarrasses him, but she's like curlers in her hair with a rolling pin. You know, they're very broad caricatures that they portray, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Why were there so many fucking plastic sheets hanging everywhere in the school? Was someone's nightmare about painting things?
Yeah, like I don't understand that. It was Xander's nightmare where he gets chased by a clown from his
eventually
sixth
confronts
birthday.
him, which we mentioned earlier. He's the only person who confronts his fear. Like Willow runs away, Buffy kind of gets it sorted out, etc.
Yeah, and he gets led into this scenario because he picks up numerous chocolate bars from the ground and just eats them. He is led the way you would lead an animal or a baby.
Yeah.
And
he just shoves them in his face.
He literally at one point has 6 of them shoved into his face. And we mentioned that early on in the episode, actually I think he wanted to talk about this in terms of the...
Yeah, so he mentions early in the episode that he's afraid of Nazis, and wouldn't you know it, some swastikas occur in the school, painted on the wall, which is just such a bad idea in a television show. Just don't draw swastikas, ever.
Well, you have to tell some intern, go draw a swastika on the wall.
At some point, someone had to draw that, and you have to be like, well, that was a thing I did. But really interestingly, I found, and I have no explanation for this, and I have no idea why this happened, but the next scene in the graveyard, after they've shown those swastikas, there's a Star of David on one of the gravestones.
Weird.
Yeah, I found it really uncomfortable, actually, because it was hard not to draw a comparison between the two. You know, Star of David occurring in a graveyard, totally natural, but
putting them in quite close proximity to each other.
Yeah, it didn't sit well with me. It's almost definitely just an overlooked weird coincidence, but it's
you avoid this by not drawing swastikas on the wall in your TV show.
You sure do. I mean, that's why you don't do it. It's an easy one. Because,
you know, let's not be naive. Like there are contexts in which that makes sense, but it's about using that responsibly. Because I know with my German heritage, I don't know if I mentioned on the show before, but like obviously a big part of what happens in Germany is how you can responsibly use imagery from the Second World War. To the extent that I mentioned this to you, I'm currently looking into getting another tattoo which has some Viking imagery in it, and I had to peruse the part of the German government's website where it's like, are these particular Viking symbols currently being used by white power or white supremacy groups?
Yeah.
So there's a certain level of you can use that stuff responsibly, not just let's just spray paint it next to an evil clown.
It wasn't good. Okay, so here, before we wrap up, no deaths in this episode, which is interesting.
No, I was about to say that while we see a lot of people die, canonically they're all alive by the end of the episode.
Yeah. Joel, tell me, what recurring nightmares do you have?
Oh, are these meant to be funny or are these meant to be actual nightmares?
I don't mind. I don't care.
Because I don't know which ones are which. So mine are not dissimilar to Giles's. So my recurring nightmare is that I am lost on the street. I don't recognize these days it would be without a phone. I don't have my glasses. And so when I don't have my glasses, I'm not blind, but things are just indistinct enough to be kind of unfamiliar. It's getting dark. And it's just a sense of like being lost away from home kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, sure.
And otherwise, I tend to have dreams that involve me when I wake up not being angry at people because we had a fight in a dream and not realizing that is not true. Like the other day, I was, angry that someone had stolen my office and work, and I was walking in ready to argue with them, and then I had to be like, oh wait, of course that didn't happen. No one came into my office over lunch and stole it. So it's a lot of that. It's a lot of displacement fear. I think yours are a little more literal in terms of
yeah. So I have a lot of the classic nightmare of my teeth falling out, and it always happens really oddly. So what'll happen is that one of two things. One is that like I'll just touch one of my teeth and it'll crumble away a little bit, and I'll be like, what the hell? I'll touch it again, and it'll just eventually just crumble out of my mouth, and that'll happen for multiple teeth. Or I'll like touch my tooth, and I'm touching my tooth now, so that's why I sound weird. I'll touch my tooth, and it'll wobble a little bit. I'm like, oh, that's weird. And I'll pull it out and I'm like, wait, that wasn't a baby tooth. And I'll eventually just pull out all my adult teeth, which is great. Because I think a lot of people who have teeth falling out dreams, it's that they have an accident or something like that, whereas mine is always of my own making.
Is it one tooth at a time, or is it like a clown's...
Always one tooth at a time.
Tissue.
Clown's tissue? Oh, no, it's
like,
always...
it's like
no, it's always one tooth at a time, and I can't stop myself from doing it. My other big nightmare... well, no, it's actually not a nightmare. A consistent theme of my dreams is that I'll put my contact lenses into my eyes.
Yes.
And it'll grow bigger and bigger, and I'll find it difficult to get into my eye, like the contact lens. And eventually I'll get it in, but it continues to grow while it's in my eye, and eventually it'll like spill out through my ears and my mouth and my nose and stuff.
Wasteful.
Yeah, exactly. Like, as in, it feels like it's grown so big in there that it's kind of gone through all the systems in my face, and like it starts like pouring out. Still part of one huge contact lens.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific. It's pretty not good. I actually do have one interesting one that I mentioned, which is topical. If I can make it interesting rather than spooky, I am prone, as you know, Ryan, to what generously might be called kind of lucid dreaming, but what you might also call night terrors.
Yeah, you do.
So I quite like this episode. My nightmares come because I'll be semi-awake, semi-asleep, and they'll be kind of, you know, I'll see someone in the corner in real life, and it'll be hard for me to believe they're not there and that kind of thing. So that's spooky as all get out, but much like the Mantis Lady episode, something that happens to me occasionally is I will wake up and you'll be in the room and I'll be like, oh, that's not Brian, that's a giant mantis creature wearing his skin. And in real life I will be screaming at you, Mantis Man, to go away from me, and you have to be like, no, Joel, I'm not a mantis wearing Brian's skin, I'm actually Brian. So that's pretty nightmarish.
Yeah, it's more nightmarish for me because sometimes you wake up and you punch me.
Yeah, well, you're a mantis.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that Kieran told me, Kieran, hi, how are you doing?
I'm pretty sure people call him Moing. Should we call him Moing?
That doesn't work. Every single person in my family except for me gets called Moing by their friends.
We should clarify that is your surname. That's the context of it.
So it doesn't really work that way because there could be any of them. But he said we should write down our ratings before we actually reveal them so that we can't change them.
Okay.
We can't have them influenced by the other person.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Because what this podcast needs is integrity.
It sure does. So are you ready to rate the episode? I'm
ready to rate the episode. I have my rating written down.
Okay, awesome. Let me just think about what I'm going to do the rating as.
Okay. So do you want me to go first?
Do you have something?
Yes, I do.
Okay, go for it.
8.2 seductive clown chocolate bars.
Oh, wow, okay. 8.2?
I really like this episode.
Holy shit.
And I can tell you that's a tooth because I have it written down on my thing.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give this episode 7.0 questionable swastikas out of 10.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that to be one of the entries on the wiki that people are going to make about this podcast.
Yeah, I know. Is that everything? Any other things?
No, I'm happy with that. I think this I'm happy to see as the show goes on, it's really starting to find its footing, I think, thematically.
Yeah.
And
I'm so excited for season 2.
I'm always excited when I see an episode or a moment with Giles or a moment with Buffy, and it's like, oh no, this is good. Like, this is good. And I'm like, oh, scribbly down.
Yeah.
But no, that's everything from us.
Next week is the Invisible Girl, which is out of mind, out of sight. It's a twisting of the original phrase.
And the Invisible Girl is
Clea Duvall. Yeah.
Clea Duvall, who we've mentioned previously is not in fact Robert Duvall. So what I will end this episode with in terms of my call to action is, if you have enjoyed this podcast or if you're just feeling particularly nice, rate us. Rate us on iTunes or whatever app you use. I don't know if anyone actually listens to podcasts on iTunes, but if you do that, it helps more people see that the podcast exists, and that would be pretty cool. Oh. So please rate us.
Please give us a really bad rating and be like, lol, Brian told me to do this.
I often hear people being like, oh, we just want your engagement, so just rate us, and if there's any issues, let us know. Please don't rate us if you didn't like it. Only rate it if you're going to rate as well. Like, life is too short to be doing that.
Is it though?
Well, look, yes. Okay. I've decided it is. So thank you. I really appreciate y'all listening, and you can follow us on Buffy Boys on various platforms.
Yeah. Buffy Boys.
Buffy
Boys.
Boys.
Yeah, there we go. See ya.
I press stop now, don't I?
Yeah.